Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new mixtape from Mick Jenkins, titled The Waters. But first, let's talk a little bit about concept albums. They got a bit of a complicated reputation among some critics, with some considering the high points of artistic creative ambitions and skill, and others calling them moments of excruciating hubris that show artists disappearing up their own ass. And let's make this clear, there are cases where both of these is pretty close to being true, but for the most part, I tend to really like concept albums, if only because they show an artist taking a really ambitious risk, and not just resorting to the default subject materials you see across multiple genres of music. So let's go further and talk about concept albums in hip-hop. And when I say that, I'm just not referring to albums that opt to have a narrative or a story or a subtle underlying theme. I'm talking about records that are focused on a single concept, usually abstract, that the rapper proceeds to explore in detail throughout an entire album. When we take a look from that particular perspective, the number of real concept albums in hip-hop dwindles down to a very small number, appreciated by critics and hardcore hip-hop nerds, but pretty much nobody else. But as experimental hip-hop continues to grow and become more accepted, I knew that it was only a matter of time before real concept albums in hip-hop became more prevalent. Enter Mick Jenkins, a Chicago MC who released his first mixtape with Trees and Truths last year that got a fair bit of critical scrutiny and critical acclaim. Not only did he display a pretty solid flow and real wordplay, he also had some interestingly textured production and some intriguing deeper themes in his albums. Now, I didn't quite love Trees and Truths. Felt a little bit long, the biblical elements, they felt a little bit shaky and poorly sketched, and the ubiquitous pitch shifting on that album got really exasperating. But you know what? It was enough to pique my interest when he dropped his second mixtape, The Waters, this year. Now let me stress that I don't normally cover mixtapes in any capacity, but considering the absurd critical acclaim this tape has gotten, and assertions that it comes together more as a fully formed concept album than most mixtapes, I figured I might as well try something new and give this album a listen. So I took a look at The Waters by Mick Jenkins. What'd I find? Well, pretty damn fascinating album, that's for damn sure. In terms of weirder MCs coming out of Chicago, Mick Jenkins is definitely the sort of rapper that I like seeing. One with ambition, solid wordplay, and some really great production to back it up. And while it's definitely an album that requires a fair amount of work to really unpack and process, it's the sort of album pushing an ideal and a real good theme that I can definitely get behind it. Is it the sort of rap album that can rise to the true greats this year in my books? Well, not quite, but there is a level of quality to this mixtape that elevates it above most rap records dropped this year and show that Mick Jenkins is definitely a force to be reckoned with coming up in the industry right now. So let's start with Mick Jenkins himself, and I gotta say, I really like him as a rapper in terms of sheer versatility and charisma. He's capable of sheer raw aggression and asserting himself as a rapper, like on the explosive final track Jerome, but it's a sort of aggression that's tempered with disdain for ignorant rappers and an ego that he can actually back up with his wordplay. And yet he's also capable of slowing it down, being a little bit more introspective, searching for that vibe connection that he can build with a girlfriend, and is very conscious of working at her pace and showing a lot of respect for her. And I really like that. Well, Jenkins isn't a fan of the conscious rap label, and honestly, it's not a really good fit for him given his conscious angle is more targeted towards fixing cultural ignorance and stupidity, something I can definitely get behind. He comes across as intelligent and very focused behind the microphone, but not so much that he loses his humanity or becomes unapproachable, which is a very human line to walk and one most conscious rappers don't pull off. The one track where he comes across as the conscious label fits a little even close is the very bleak track Martyrs, where he takes a look at some of the common sentiments of the shallow materialistic ambitions of some rappers, jacks them for his hook, and then draws the parallel to the death sentence that some of those particular ambitions can become. Now this links back to the lyrics and wordplay of this album, and for the most part, I dug the hell out of Mick Jenkins' flow and energy and wordplay. From a technical standpoint, he's the sort of rapper that can interweave some really dense references into his wordplay while still bringing out real hard-hitting punchlines, the best sort of balance as a rapper. And while there are definitely some running idiosyncrasies throughout Mick Jenkins' music that can get a little bit played out or even borrowed from other artists, the constant references to Canada Dry, Ginger Ale, and Montreal, both including songs devoted to both of them that they're not bad songs, but they can be a little bit redundant redundant throughout the entire mixtape. And of course the references that Kanye West has already used, like the Jerome reference to the 90s Martin Lawrence TV show, which came across on Bound 2 and was repeated on this album, just felt a little bit redundant and copied there. But for the most part, his references are layered, crisp, and have a lot of punch. Now, one of the biggest concerns with most concept albums, particularly in rap music, is that they can't sustain their concept or do enough new beyond the first couple tracks off the list. But to his credit, Mick Jenkins manages to make the water motif work for more than just a universal symbol of knowledge and goodness that we all need, which is really probably the best use of the symbol that he's got on this album. The opening track, Shipwrecked, is a good contrary example, using imagery associated with the Titanic and sinking ships to show just how people get on board with various bad lifestyle decisions like gangbanging until they hit the metaphorical iceberg of realization. Something that Mick Jenkins is actually comfortable with being on that ship because he's used to those waters and he can rise above it. What's also telling is how much Mick Jenkins positions himself as an outsider able to swim in those rough waters, unlike most of the rap industry. He's the black sheep that builds attraction based upon being a straight shooter and having a certain rugged honesty to him. And it's a role that he's very comfortable in, both in his production and across the rest of the rap scene. And while he's not trying to rock the boat, references to Aaliyah really pepper this album, the knowledge and truth that seems to be spilling out of him at every single turn, either through the biblical references that are all across this record in return from his previous mixtape, or callbacks to classic jazz or mainstream pop culture. And you can tell while he's not trying to stir up trouble, he'd be the type to take a turn at the wheel and then jerk it around enough just to knock the fakers flat, and I really did like that. And what's all the more impressive is how well his production mirrors all of those water references throughout the mixtape. While it could have been easy to drown out this record in reverb and make it sound like literally submerged, Mick Jenkins and his producers are more subtle than that, and instead constructed one of the most gracefully melodic hip-hop albums that I've heard this year, and I really dug it. The waves balanced against the drifting guitars on Shipwrecked with a phenomenal beat change up near the back half of the song that I liked, the eerie synth balanced against the hi-hats on the waters, the great guitar melody on Healer that I really liked, the scratchy haze on Vibe that's reminiscent of Rainfall, the creaking thickness of jazz with the guitar leads bleeding across it, I really like that, the shimmering synths of Black Sheep, the staccato fluttering beat on Drink More Water, great beat there, the deep rumble of the guitars on Canada Dry, the heavy rough edge bass on Dehydration that I honestly wish we heard more of, and of course the Nina Simone Strange Fruit sample on Martyrs that manages to be completely different from when Kanye West used that exact same sample on Blood in the Leaves, and Mick Jenkins makes it just as relevant. Now, if I were to have any issues with the production, it'd come down to two small points. The first is that this album can run into problems with momentum. By submerging the melodies and going for this real watery, heavy feel, it can make the album start to feel a little bit long, especially towards the beginning. Then Mick Jenkins does compensate this with some real lyrical and vocal intensity, but it's tough when his voice feels just submerged under enough reverb to add to the heaviness rather than take away from it. Now granted, this does not become a problem whatsoever near the back half of the mixtape, and this is where we start to run into the second problem. Namely that some of the beats and some of the tracks feel a little bit too aggressive to fit cohesively with the rest of the album. Now, the warning for this was on Who Else, which had some really great lyrics in the verses and the references, but the beat felt a little bit too busy, especially with the clattering percussion in the mid-range, just got distracting there. And of course, there was Jerome as the closer, a track soaked in organ and scratching with Mick Jenkins going toe-to-toe with Joey Badass with sheer roaring intensity, and even maintaining the water motif with references just being able to swim with the sharks that I really liked. But the song is so loud and aggressive that it feels really out of place with the rest of the album. Still a really good song I liked. Hell, I don't think there's a track on this mixtape that I would consider even bad or even mediocre. But honestly, the song did feel a little bit out of place with the rest of the album. Just had to mention that. So considering how much I do love the wordplay and how much of the production is so awesome, what is ultimately holding this album back from being truly amazing or a classic in my books? Well, there are a few things. First is the guest appearances. While I do feel that Gene Doe's verse on Healer really did fit the tone and tempo of the track, I did feel that No Name Gypsy's verse on Comfortable didn't quite work as well, kind of a bit of a throwaway verse, and didn't quite fit as well with the rest of the song. And while I really did like the hook on By the Mind on Shipwreck, just worked so well, I found the hook on Dehydration just to be a little bit overmixed and busy to fit with the rest of the verses. And ultimately, coming back to the central concept of the album, while I really do feel that Mick Jenkins did a really impressive job interweaving the water references and the symbolism across the mixtape, I do feel that it was missing that final track, that thesis statement, they hammered the disconnected references together into a really strong point to drive the water motif home and make a really potent album statement. Now, I get that last nitpick is probably a little bit too much to ask for on a mixtape of all things, which is why I don't tend to usually cover mixtapes, but honestly, I think Mick Jenkins, he could have pulled it off, which means I can't help but feel that a little bit surprised he ended the mixtape with Jerome. Sure, go on a high note with a lot of energy, but it didn't exactly have the lyrical power to really tie everything together outside of just sheer aggression. No matter how much I did appreciate all of that aggression. But you know what? Look, that is nitpicking because this mixtape was genuinely great. Mick Jenkins proved with The Waters that he's a real talent to watch going forward. And if he doesn't manage to explode in the next few years, especially given his charisma and his presence and his gift for writing some really stellar production, I will be shocked if this guy does not blow up. Now, I will say this album is not for everyone. The production takes a little bit of time to get used to, is definitely a grower, and his gift for wordplay means that this album, it does take a while to really truly decode and deconstruct and unpack. But believe me, it's definitely worth it if you want to put the effort in. I think this album's a strong 8 out of 10, and definitely recommendation is in order. I may have gotten to this mixtape late, being sick, I'm sorry about that, but I'm definitely glad that I got to it. And if you have not checked out Mick Jenkins yet, you're definitely missing out. So go check this album out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yeah, I got to this mixtape a little bit late, but god damn it, I heard it and I really want to talk about it. But if there's anything else I might be able to cover in the next couple of weeks that you want me to talk about, or if there's anything else I might be able to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.